Welcome to the culmination of a year's work on the D-Day wall. Today, we're going to tell you the story of the work on the wall over the last year or so. We'll talk about the archaeology involved, the research involved, tell you about the people, the American soldiers that we found out so much about. This is Gary Momben. I'm standing here today as Director of the Maritime Archaeology Trust. We're an organisation that has been working in Southampton for over 30 years, and we've been pulling together information about the past, the heritage of the city, in the surrounding area, to get out and share it with the people. And this D-Day wall is a prime example of our work. We've been funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund to research the names of many of the individuals involved. We've tracked them through to America, and we've actually got a lot of information about the individuals, all of which is accessible online on a website. It's a 3D model for you, the residents of Southampton, and anyone else around the world to find out more about.
The D-Day wall is a brick wall in Western Esplanade, Southampton, England, where more than 70 American service personnel carved their names before embarking overseas during World War II. Between April 2019 and January 2021, the Maritime Archaeology Trust, with funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, undertook a project to create a digital preservation of these inscriptions, using detailed photographs and modelling techniques, to research and tell the stories of these men and to raise awareness of Southampton's World War II heritage. In total, 76 inscriptions were recorded, and from these, 69 men were identified, representing 29 different US states. We have made contact with 19 of the men's families. This could not have been possible without the help of more than 75 volunteers involved in all aspects of this project. In this film, we will detail Southampton's role during World War II and explain why the US troops were here and the pivotal part Southampton played in D-Day. We will detail the process of recording the wall and researching the names, and reveal some of the fascinating stories uncovered by our volunteers. We will tell you about the resources we have created to help you discover more. We will also hear from some of the volunteers about their experiences and discuss the long-term legacy of the project. To understand who these Americans were and why they carved on the wall, we need to look back at the events of World War II. The British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain announced that Britain was at war with Germany on the 3rd of August 1939. War had seemed inevitable for some time, so once declared, plans were quickly put in motion. The evacuation of children from Southampton to the countryside for safety had begun 2 days earlier. From as far back as Henry V and Agincourt, Southampton has been a departure point for soldiers. In the First World War, it was the #1 port of embarkation for troops and supplies, and this role was resumed for the duration of the Second World War. Southampton Water is a protected deep water inlet connecting to the Solent and the English Channel. It is sheltered by the Isle of Wight and has the benefits of double high water, perfect for receiving and embarking large numbers of vessels. With good railway connections and deep docks able to accommodate the largest ships of the time. The British Expeditionary Force sailed from Southampton to Cherbourg 6 days after the declaration. But by the end of May 1940, the German army had pushed the Allied forces back to Dunkirk. Churchill immediately commenced Operation Dynamo, urging every seaworthy vessel to help in the evacuation. Many of the battle-weary men were brought back to Southampton. The steam tug Challenge, now based in Southampton, was one of those famous little ships. After Dunkirk, the war turned to the skies. Southampton was the home of the Spitfire, designed by Reginald Mitchell. It first took flight at Southampton Airport on the 5th of March 1936. The Spitfire factories and the docks made Southampton a prime target for enemy bombing raids. Southampton was thought to be the 7th most bombed city in the UK, with 57 attacks resulting in the destruction or damage of more than 45,000 buildings in the city. In September 1940, several raids caused destruction in the factories and claimed the lives of many workers. The Supermarine factory was virtually destroyed during a daylight raid, but production did not stop. Instead, it was dispersed to buildings across the city under the Shadow Factory scheme. Unable to achieve air supremacy, Hitler abandoned his imminent plans to invade Britain. Limited planning for an Allied invasion of Europe had begun in 1940. Southampton was surveyed and chosen as a base for the invasion of Europe. Now, in April 1942, the British and American governments agreed to commence the build-up. The Southampton area, extending from Winchester to Hedge End and to Romsey, was designated Area C. the Southwestern House Hotel, was requisitioned by the Royal Navy as the headquarters of Combined Operations Military Movement Control, codenamed HMS Shrapnel. Churchill and Eisenhower are known to have met here to discuss the plans for Operation Neptune and D-Day. Before an invasion could be launched, resources were required. The docks had been closed whilst there was a threat of air raid, but reopened in February 1942, once this threat had passed. Immediately, Lend-Lease cargoes began to arrive from America. Food was the first aid to arrive, and just in time as the country was close to starvation due to the German blockade. Then followed a wide assortment of warships, planes, locomotive engines, military vehicles and weapons. The Southampton dock workers were particularly impressed with the forklift trucks, which they had never seen before. After the initial invasion, the ongoing supply of the Allied army would require reports. The D-Day planners decided to take a port with them, and so the secret construction of 2 Mulberry harbours began in 1943, with component parts being built all along the south coast. 2 of the Phoenix concrete caissons were built in Southampton dry docks, and a Whale Railway section can still be seen at the ferry terminal. The Mulberry harbours were to be towed over to Normandy with the invasion fleet, and as soon as the beaches were captured they were to be sunk to form harbours, with roadways that would enable the landing of heavy equipment and supplies. Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, would ensure a good supply of fuel. At the same time, embarkation hards were prepared all along the south coast to enable landing craft to beach whatever the tide, to load troops and vehicles. 4 such hards were built in Southampton. This required concrete to be laid between the high and low water marks. The distinctive hardening mats, often referred to as chocolate blocks, can still be found at locations along the coast. America entered the war after the Japanese attacked the US Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. Churchill and Roosevelt met in America at the Washington Conference, where they agreed an Allied strategy of Europe first, to defeat Hitler and Mussolini before dealing with Japan. This began a chain of events that would lead to D-Day. The first was Operation Bolero, or the Friendly Invasion, as it's affectionately remembered. From mid-1942, the large-scale build-up of American forces in Britain began. The US Army 14th Major Port Transportation Corps arrived in Southampton in July 1943. Their role was to coordinate the shipment of American troops, equipment and stores through the port, working jointly with the Southern Railway and the British Army and Navy. US Army offices were set up in Maritime Chambers and the Civic Centre. The officers were billeted in the Polygon Hotel, and the headquarters was set up on Hoglands Park. The numerous Nissen huts where the men lived was nicknamed Tin City by the locals. At its peak in November 1944, US military port personnel numbered more than 6,500 men. In the spring of 1944, the battalions attached to the 14th Port began to arrive. The US Army records, known as the 14th Port Books, state that black soldiers were in segregated units with separate work details, billets, recreational facilities and Red Cross clubs. These battalions were billeted in Askew Park Road School and later at the Blymount Barracks in Millbrook, and in camps outside the town. The US Navy set up their headquarters in the Star Hotel in the High Street. American civilian tug crews who would help tow the Mulberry harbours were also stationed in Southampton, together with members of the American Women's Auxiliary Corps. Both the American and British governments anticipated that trouble might arise from Americans living and working alongside British civilians, and so US military police were sent to Britain to keep the peace. To facilitate good relations, all US troops were issued with a booklet produced by the War Department and watched a film, How to Behave in Britain. These instructions were intended to reduce the culture shock and to advise on the peculiarities of the British, their country and their ways. In fact, the Americans were welcomed in Southampton with open arms, and they mostly lived and worked together happily. It became an evening's entertainment to walk the streets looking at the new US military vehicles that had arrived and wondering at their purpose. Besides natural curiosity, the Good Neighbour scheme encouraged residents to look after the US troops living outside their homes. Many oral histories, such as this by 15-year-old Jan Caesar, are testimony.
US convoys were parked all along the streets in Southampton waiting for the off. My mother took pity on the men who were desperately tired and had been forced to sleep in their lorries. She invited several into our home where they crashed out on her beds and chairs. My mother didn't have much to offer because of rationing, but she made gallons of tea and cut piles of bread for cucumber sandwiches, which they thought was so English. In return, they gave us some of their rations. They made our eyes pop out. Tins of meat, fruit, sweets and chocolate.
The local women were happy to darn socks, sew on buttons and provide water for shaving. When the men were off duty, they would pass the time playing with the local children and taking local ladies on dates to the movies or the dances. Children would cry, "Got any gum, chum?" And sometimes the soldiers replied, "Got a sister, mister?" 25-year-old Dalton Newfield from California was the Provost Marshal in charge of the US Military Police, the MPs, in Southampton. His office was a Nissen hut at the 14th Port Headquarters in Hoglands Park. Besides keeping the peace, MPs also performed traffic duties, ensuring a good flow of military vehicles, security details in the dock, and guarding prisoners of war. Dalton was a keen photographer, and his archive of photographs held by Southampton Heritage Collections offer a unique insight into the lives of US servicemen in Southampton during World War II. It seems strange now to see the US uniforms and military vehicles against the backdrop of the familiar medieval city walls and buildings. Dalton's photographs capture their social lives. The weekly dances held at the Polygon Hotel and the Guildhall, with music provided by the US 14th Port Orchestra, the NAFI Canteen and Red Cross Club, and even a fete. Dalton enjoyed watching the American football matches held at the Dell, the former home of Southampton Football Club. The Americans had 12 basketball teams and enjoyed soccer, darts, boxing and ping pong. The photographs also show US troops arriving at Southampton train station, queuing in the docks and boarding ships. Inside the docks there are photographs of equipment being loaded and unloaded, and German prisoners of war being marched to the transit camp at Dock Gate 8. Finally, they capture the smiles as they said their goodbyes at the end of the war and headed home. The 14th Port Book records the MPs in Southampton dealt with 27 violent incidents between the segregated US troops and 31 fights between British and American personnel between 1943 and 1945. These fights were usually caused by one of two things: the British woman's preference for American men and indifference to colour, and alcohol. With their higher pay, the Americans were said to have drunk the pubs dry, much to the disgust of the British troops, leading to the phrase overpaid, oversexed and over here. Dalton's friend and fellow MP, Lieutenant Jack Booser, appears in many of the photographs. Both Jack and Dalton met their future wives in England. Relationships were discouraged but not uncommon. Some 70,000 British war brides and children from all over the UK departed from Southampton at the end of the war, but not all. Southampton resident Pauline Natividad was the proud daughter of an American medic. After meeting her mother, he took part in the D-Day landings. They kept in touch, and when he was injured in France, he was able to get sent back to a hospital nearby and saw Pauline shortly after she was born. But soon after, he was sent back to the US. Pauline successfully traced her father to Texas in 1988, and they were able to meet several times. Over the years, Pauline helped many people trace their GI fathers. From early 1944, access to the area surrounding Southampton waterfront was restricted. Streets such as Western Esplanade and Platform Road were sealed off. A one-way system was established to facilitate the flow of military vehicles approaching the waterfront. Schools were requisitioned and turned into barracks, medical centres and mortuaries, and many private houses and commercial buildings were requisitioned too. The Royal Victoria Hospital at Netley was placed under the control of the US Navy. Camps were built on the common, the city's parks and in the surrounding areas to marshal troops before they embarked to France. The British and Canadian troops began to arrive in March. Landing craft filled every inlet and lines of vehicles stretched from the waterfront all through the city and in the surrounding streets. Smoke screens and camouflage nets strung between the trees hid the build-up from the air. Arthur Daniel, a resident of Southampton, kept a diary throughout the war. On Saturday, the 22nd of April 1944, he recorded, "Southampton is packed with troops. There are camps on every available piece of spare ground. Invasion fever is gripping everyone." The troops would often move out early in the morning for training and come back later in the day. People were used to seeing them coming and going and would wave and cheer as they passed. Many people who saw the troops leaving on Operation Fabius, a full-scale rehearsal with landings at Hayling Island, thought that was the beginning of the invasion, and were very surprised when they returned. Practices proved that Southampton could load 50,000 troops and 7,000 vehicles in a single day. Operation Neptune was the code name given to the airborne and seaborne aspect of the D-Day invasion. On D-Day, British Force G, 3/4 of the whole British force, sailed from Southampton to Gold Beach, and Force J, which included the Canadians and the British and French commandos, sailed from the River Hamble and Stokes Bay to Juno and Sword Beaches. The American forces sailed from Portland, Weymouth and Dartmouth to Omaha and Utah beaches, though a few specialist units did also embark from Southampton later in the day. D-Day had been set for the 5th of June. Men and vehicles had begun to load onto landing craft from the 31st of May. Once filled, the landing craft would move out into the Solent and wait at anchor to allow more craft to come in. A forecast of bad weather for the 5th meant the invasion had to be postponed a day. For many men, this meant an extra uncomfortable and anxious night at sea. On D-Day, the 6th of June 1944, the Dragoon Guards with their tanks who had embarked from Leap under Southampton control were the first to land on Gold Beach at 07:25. They were followed throughout the day by units of the 50th Infantry Division. By the end of the day, 25,000 men had landed on Gold Beach, though 89 landing craft had been destroyed in the process. A constant supply of British troops marshalled in Southampton from the outlying camps. Landing craft plied back and forth between Southampton and Gold Beach for the next 5 days until all units of the 50th Division had landed. Many of the troops who sailed on D-Day suffered terrible seasickness due to the rough sea conditions. Force J, destined for the Canadian Juno Beach and British Sword Beach, embarked jointly from Southampton and the 4 Hards at Stokes Bay in Gosport. The Canadian 3rd Infantry and 2nd Armoured Divisions embarked from Town Quay, Southampton to Juno Beach. 177 Free French troops led by Philip Kiefer embarked from Southampton to Sword Beach, and British Royal Marine Commandos sailed from the River Hamble at Warsash to Juno, Sword and Gold Beaches. Among them were the 1st Commando, led by Lord Lovat and Piper Bill Millin. The commandos faced many obstacles, and by the end of the day, half of the number 48 Royal Commandos headed for Juno had been lost. Oral histories record the residents of Southampton's surprise to wake up and find the city completely empty of vehicles and troops. At 10 a.m, a news broadcast announced that the invasion had begun. Within hours, more troops arrived in the city, and so it continued, a constant flow of men and vehicles to France, with landing craft running a continual shuttle service throughout the duration of the war in Europe. But that was only the beginning for Southampton. Later that day, the wounded started to return, and in the days following, German prisoners of war arrived and were processed at the camp near Dockgate 8 before being sent to camps throughout the UK. By October of 1944, more than 58,000 German prisoners of war had arrived in Southampton. In the weeks and months following D-Day, replacement soldiers and new US divisions flowed to the UK. Usually they arrived on liners such as the Queen Mary or the SS Aquitania in Greenock-on-the-Clyde, Liverpool or Southampton. They were billeted throughout the UK for further training and preparation before embarking to France. British and American reinforcements steadily embarked from Southampton to Le Havre or Omaha Beach. Often they were unable to land on arrival in France due to the weather, and had to wait several days until the seas were calm enough for the troops to be able to clamber down the scramble nets and into the smaller craft that would ferry them to shore. By the end of the war, over 2 million American troops had passed through Southampton, 3.5 million Allied troops in total. A counter on the gangplank recorded the millionth Yank, Paul Schimmer Jr. from Pennsylvania, who embarked on the 25th of October 1944. A short ceremony officiated by the mayor commenced as he boarded the ship. When Mayor Rex Stranger later heard of Sergeant Schimmer's death in Germany in April 1945, he set up a trust fund for his young daughter, and there began a long association between the town and the family. The 2 millionth American passed through on the 16th of January 1945. Crossing the Channel was always a risk. Vessels sailed at night, in convoy, and with escorts as protection against the U-boats that hunted in the Channel. The greatest tragedy was the loss of the Belgian ship the SS Leopoldville on Christmas Eve 1944 as it made its 35th Channel crossing. The SS Leopoldville and the SS Cheshire left Southampton carrying soldiers of the US 66th Infantry Division. Despite zigzagging and a 4-ship escort, a torpedo struck the Leopoldville 5.5 miles off the coast of Cherbourg. 763 American soldiers were killed, 493 of whom were never recovered. Survivors were forbidden to mention it, and documents about the incident remained classified until 1996. On the 11th of September 1945, the Port of Southampton was awarded the Meritorious Service Plaque. This was followed on the 29th of October by the Freedom of the City, awarded by Southampton City Council. At a press day given by the 14th Port on the 1st of December, just prior to the Army leaving Southampton, the major accomplishments were outlined. The 14th Port presented 4 bronze plaques in tribute to the US troops at 4 locations in Southampton. Dockgate 8, the Polygon Hotel, now demolished, the Civic Centre, and the Pilgrim Fathers Memorial. The wording of the Pilgrim Fathers Memorial was a reminder that the Pilgrim Fathers left from almost the same spot, the West Gate, to fight for freedom, and how during World War II their descendants returned to fight for freedom in Europe. Many of the troops arriving in Southampton had embarked from Camp Miles Standish in Boston, which was named after the English military officer hired by the Plymouth colony. Standish had sailed from Southampton on the Speedwell in 1620. The other memorial is the D-Day wall. Today, the 19-metre-long section of brick wall, referred to as the D-Day or American Wall, forms the boundary of the hotel car park. The wall can be seen on the 1948 OS map, marking the boundary of the city mortuary and clinic. This 1946 aerial photograph shows the mortuary complex. The arrow shows the position of the wall that we recorded, and the circles show the position of a further section of perimeter wall closer to the waterfront and houses across the road in Forest View. Both contained inscribed bricks and both have since been demolished. The houses across the road were demolished in 1973 and replaced with flats in 1981. This photograph by Southampton resident Cyril Foster is the only photograph we have of the carved bricks on the houses. The significance of the soldiers' inscriptions on the houses was first realised by local resident Mr. Norman Webb, a lithographic corrector working for the government who passed by on his way to work. In May 1973, the houses were marked for demolition. Mr. Webb wrote to the City of Southampton Museum Service and highlighted the historical importance of the bricks. At the same time, he wrote to the American newspapers in an attempt to trace the men or their relatives. It is not certain how many names Mr. Webb identified, but his file contains a list of addresses for 13 men that he wrote to. 5 of the men replied back. By July, he had secured agreement with the City Council that the best carved bricks would be preserved. Mr. Webb's files have been digitised as part of this project, and further research was undertaken into the names he recorded. The files contain 3 newspaper articles by American reporters who had each traced one of these men. When interviewed by the Bolivar Commercial, Walter Wells admitted to scratching his name and Cleveland Miss in walls and bricks all over England, France and Germany during his service as a line sergeant during the war. We did that for soldiers coming behind us. A lot of times when we would be behind other outfits, we would see the same thing, names and towns inscribed in the wall, he explained. In the 1980s, plans were approved for the demolition of the complex and the building of the present hotel. With the knowledge of the importance of the inscribed bricks, a photographic survey was undertaken by Southampton City Council of the section of wall nearest the waterfront that was to be demolished. The other section, which contained a greater number of bricks, was allowed to remain as a memorial and is registered as such with the Imperial War Museum. Behind the wall in the hotel car park, a new section of wall was built to incorporate the best bricks rescued from the demolished wall and the houses. By studying photographs from the 1993 survey held in the Historic Environment Record, it is possible to see some of these bricks in the original position. It is evident that some have become separated from one another before they were rebuilt into the small wall. Some bricks that form part of the inscriptions are still in museum stores, and they too have been recorded as part of this project. All of the names found on the wall belong to US service personnel. It seems they either had to wait near the wall in their vehicles to load up, or they may have wandered by on foot, passing the time. Seeing other names in American towns on the wall encouraged these men to add their own. From the wall, it is only a very short walk or drive round to any of the 4 embarkation yards. More than 75 volunteers have been involved in all aspects of this project, from recording the bricks to researching names online, researching in the archives and writing articles, and helping with the education and outreach events. On recording days, volunteers help to systematically record the wall brick by brick, taking detailed photographs and recording what they could see, sometimes using touch and torchlight to try to decipher the lettering. It soon became apparent how much the visibility of these inscriptions varies in different weather conditions. In dry and bright conditions, the inscriptions almost disappear. They are most visible when the wall is wet and the sky is overcast. Frost and the seasonal growth of moss can aid or hinder their visibility. Volunteers were trained in basic digital SLR camera operation and in techniques such as photogrammetry and reflectance translucence imaging (RTI). Each of the close-up photographs in the viewer was selected from the best of those taken under different weather conditions. Many have been digitally enhanced to increase the visibility of the inscription by altering the highlights and shadows and filter or removing the colours. This simple process alone revealed parts of the inscriptions that were not visible to the eye. The 3D model of the wall was created with photogrammetry. This involved taking overlapping images at set heights and distances, which the software then processes into a 3D model. Some of the inscriptions are only visible as faint markings, and so we tried to capture some of these with RTI. In several cases, this did enable us to see the inscription much clearer. One inscription looked to the eye to be J.C. Wirt, but when that name was not found in the US military records, RTI photography revealed it was in fact J.E. Words, and the inscription was then identified as James Edward Words, serving with the Transportation Corps. In other cases, it made the inscription clearer to see, but the clarity of the carving was too vague to decipher. From the results of these recording sessions, a list of names and a schematic drawing was produced. The drawing makes it much easier to see the relationships between the inscribed bricks. The inscription left by Lawrence Mathis is deeply carved and takes up a full 11 bricks. It contains his full name, date and hometown. This would suggest he was here at the wall longer than some of the others, Andy Lamb, for example, whose inscription consists only of their name, quickly scratched onto 1 or 2 bricks. These inscriptions were probably carved with their army knives. The majority include their first name or initials, surname, hometown and sometimes a date. A few others contain features such as anchors, or in Mayer's case, the outline of a landing craft. In some cases, arrows were used to link inscriptions. Each carving is completely unique in style and really does reflect the creator's handwriting. James Henley is an excellent example. The handwriting on his draft card matched his carving on the wall almost perfectly, ruling out other possible candidates for the same name. James dated his inscription, and the same date occurs in several other inscriptions, suggesting that these men might have been from the same unit, standing at the wall together. When researching James Henley, his army serial number was picked up on the passenger muster list for LST 262, which sailed from Southampton on Christmas Day 1944. The list records that he was sailing with the 449th Quartermaster's Gasoline Supply Company. By checking the names of the other inscriptions with the same date, we were able to confirm the identity of 8 more men, all serving with the same unit of quartermasters. Several groups of men have been identified in a similar way using unit rosters. The wall has been known as the D-Day Wall because it was thought that these inscriptions belonged to men queuing here ready to embark on D-Day. In fact, these inscriptions represent US troops passing through the city from the lead up to D-Day, all through the war and into early 1946. The majority were passing through here for the first time, as replacements or as part of new divisions entering the war for the first time. Others had participated in the D-Day invasions and were in Southampton to return for the second time after recovering from injuries. The US 9th Infantry Division had already fought in North Africa and Sicily and had returned to Winchester to prepare for the Normandy invasion. They embarked from Southampton to Utah Beach on the 7th of June. The earliest known inscription belongs to Sidney Greenwald. Although the inscription is not dated, research has shown he landed in Normandy on D-Day +6, the 12th of June. This brick was saved from the demolished houses and is in the care of Southampton museums. The latest inscription we can date, again from research rather than the brick itself, is Leander's Beale. Lee passed through Southampton in January 1946. He was 18 when he was enlisted in May 1945 and after basic training was sent overseas on occupation duties until August 1946 as a replacement for the demobilised quartermasters who had served since the start of the war. The quartermaster units were segregated by colour. The 449th were an African American unit. It was pleasing to find their names on the wall intermingled with the white soldiers' names and with no way to distinguish them. The research volunteers have been invaluable in linking the inscriptions on the bricks to men identifiable in the World War II US military records. Some of the volunteers were already experienced family researchers, but to some this was completely new. With these being American records, research into these names was limited to online sources. The American archives in St. Louis, where the World War II military records are kept, suffered a fire in 1973 that destroyed 18 million military personnel files. Despite this, it has still been possible to obtain enough information from the online records to piece together enough service information for most of these men. The website findagrave.com has also been very useful, as there is a custom in America of adding service plaques to veterans' headstones, and in some cases this has been the only way to determine which unit a man served with. Many World War II units have associations and Facebook groups, and these have also proved an invaluable source of information. Some of the searches came up with instant hits, but the majority took quite a lot of perseverance and persistence by our volunteers. Of the 76 inscriptions recorded, there are only 7 that we cannot trace at all, and this is because they are just a single name. There are a couple of instances where there were just too many men from the same state with the same name to whittle it down to one individual, and unlike James Henley, some of the draft cards were typed, so the style of handwriting could not be matched. Volunteers made contact with family members of 19 of the men, and many of those have expressed their thanks for the photographs sent of the inscriptions that they did not even know existed. Many of the families have provided memories, photographs, and wartime letters written by their relatives. In this section we will tell some of the fascinating stories revealed by volunteers researching the names on the wall. 2 of the most visible names on the wall belong to Kurt Hodges and William Muller. Deeply carved and next to each other, these inscriptions are almost as clear now as they were 76 years ago. The discovery of a roster allowed us to identify these 2 men as serving with the 106th Infantry Division. The inscriptions left by 7 more men on the roster were later matched. John Curtis Hodges, or Kurt as he was known, was born in Texas and spent the latter half of his childhood in Illinois. Having learnt to drive and maintain vehicles in his father's taxi and bus business, he joined the army as a transport corporal in 1943, aged 18. He trained with the 106th Division at Camp Atterbury, Indiana, where he met William Muller and formed a friendship that would last until Kurt's death in 2017. William Muller was born in Yonkers, New York. Aged 18, he was at college as part of the Army's Specialised Training Programme when he was enlisted in March 1943. He was sent to Camp Atterbury to join the 106th just a month before they left the United States. Kurt and William were both assigned to the 44th Regiment Heavy Weapons Company M. The roster shows they were with the 3rd Platoon. The 106th Division was an all-draftee division with an average age of 20. It was also the last US infantry division to be raised during World War II. A diary kept by Sergeant Ralph Weiss of the same 44th Regiment gives a good account of events. Ralph records that the 12,000-strong division sailed from New York on the 20th of October 1944 on the SS Aquitania, and they arrived in Scotland 6 days later. They were taken by train to Chipping Norton, where they were camped for a month. On the 2nd of December, they boarded trains to Southampton, arriving at 5 o'clock in the morning. They then had a 4-hour wait before boarding the ships. As drivers, we think these men were parked in their vehicles in Western Esplanade waiting to load up. This is when they decided to add their names to the wall, seeing the names of those who had gone before. Once boarded, the ships anchored in the Solent, waiting for the cover of darkness to sail. The men woke up off the French coast, but stormy conditions made it unsafe to scramble down the cargo nets and into the smaller boats that would ferry them to shore. It was a whole 4 days before they could land. On reaching French shores, seasick, tired, cold and hungry, they were taken by truck on a cold, bumpy ride through France and into Belgium during the coldest winter on record. They arrived in the Ardennes on the 9th of December. The intention had been to gather the division and acclimatise these inexperienced men in this quiet area. However, a week later they were taken by surprise when Hitler launched what would be his last offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, which would rage on for 5 weeks, and the 106th were on the front line. The 424th Regiment were able to hold their position for 5 days until reinforcements broke through. The other 2 divisions, the 422nd and the 423rd, had been encircled and were forced to surrender. The Battle of the Bulge was America's biggest infantry battle, and both sides suffered huge losses. Both Kurt and William survived the war, though Kurt's hearing was permanently damaged by the artillery, and William suffered with leg conditions resulting from the cold. They kept in contact and attended reunions. Kurt returned to Chicago, where he worked for the railroad and later drove Greyhound buses for 17 years. After a series of moves to Arizona, California and Utah, Kurt settled back in Texas in 2005, where he lived until he passed away in 2017, aged 93. William returned to New York and studied for a master's degree in aeronautical engineering. He joined the Grumman Corporation in New York, where he specialised in engineering design and held several senior positions. His achievements included the co-invention of the Lunar Module Alignment System, part of the Apollo space program, and working on the F-4 Tomcat fighter plane. In September 1989, Bill was among a group of 106 veterans who travelled to Spinau in Belgium to unveil a memorial erected by the villagers in thanks to the 424th Infantry Regiment for the liberation of their village in January 1945. We were honoured to have corresponded several times with William before he died. He was fascinated to hear of the interest the bricks were attracting and to see photographs of it after all these years. In a telephone call in January 2020, he laughingly explained that he was nicknamed Wimpy after the Popeye character due to his man-sized appetite during the war. Sadly, William passed away in September 2020, aged 95. From the roster, 7 more drivers with the 3rd platoon were identified. Ken Colby, an 18-year-old baker from New Hampshire. Walter Shirk, 18 years old, farm labourer from Pennsylvania. Bill Roby, 18-year-old factory worker from Kentucky. Ralph Odom, 21-year-old farm labourer from Alabama. Wilson Hall, 27-year-old truck driver from Virginia. Jack Kelly, a 19-year-old fishmonger from Louisiana. And Delbert Smith, 20-year-old farm labourer from Mississippi. Delbert's inscription was particularly poignant. Delbert had married Ethel shortly before he was enlisted in March 1943 and sent to train with the 106th. Their daughter Nina was born the same year. As Delbert waited with his platoon at the wall, he carved not only his name, but also added Darnina and wife Ethel. Delbert clearly had his family at the forefront of his mind as he anxiously waited to embark. Incredibly, all 9 men survived the war and returned home.
Private Sidney Greenwald was a combat engineer with the US Third Army. He sailed from Southampton to Omaha, landing on the 12th of June 1944, just 6 days after D-Day. Sidney was born in Czechoslovakia in 1913 and emigrated with his parents to New York in 1934. He was working as a glazier when in 1941, aged 27, he enlisted with the combat engineers. He participated in the Normandy campaign and later in the Battle of the Bulge, earning 5 battle stars. Sidney returned to New York in 1946, where he married and raised a family. He was a much-missed member of the local community, passing away in 2011, aged 98, and leaving 30 great-grandchildren. The brick that Sidney inscribed while in Southampton is one of the most detailed, including "On way to France, Sidney Greenwald, 320-81546, US Bronx, New York." An anchor symbol is also visible. The brick was saved and is now held within the Southampton Museum collection. For the 60th anniversary of D-Day, the brick was on public display, and it inspired a Southampton resident, Pauline Natividad, to find Sidney and send him a photo of the brick. A letter from Sidney's son confirmed that his father had inscribed the brick, and writing again after the death of his father, he said the news of the brick had brought him much joy. The brick was displayed outside the Mayor's Parlour again for the 75th anniversary of D-Day in 2019. Calvert Richard Avery served as a field director with the American Red Cross. He was born in 1910 in Yonkers, New York. In 1930, Cal is recorded as working as a chemist's assistant for a research institute. In 1932, he marries Louise, and by 1940 they have 2 children and are living at an orphanage in Trivoli, where Cal is superintendent. He was drafted in October 1940 as a field director with the Red Cross. They often recruited men with social care or education backgrounds who were deployed alongside military units to look after the welfare of the men, from landing on the beaches on D-Day until the end of the war. Pastoral roles are seldom recorded in World War II histories. They wore an army uniform with Red Cross patches. Cal must have been in Southampton sometime after August 1944, although it has not been possible to determine which unit he was assigned to. It has also been hard to trace Cal after the war, but a 1956 newspaper article records his son's graduation. At that time, he was living at Annandale on the Hudson. Cal passed away in July 1987 at St Thomas in the Virgin Islands.
Paul Urban was born in Chicago, Illinois on the 5th of August 1915. Bill was the second of 7 children born to William and Ida. Both of William's parents were born in Illinois, though both of his father's parents were Lithuanian and his mother's parents were both German. In 1920, the census shows the Urban family living in Chicago, with the father working as a machinist in a machine shop. Many of the neighbours are of European origin. By 1930, the family had moved to Leyden. By 1940, the family were back in Chicago, and Bill was working as an assembler at the Phoenix Metal Cap Company. These are the same details he enters on his draft registration card on the 16th of October 1940. Bill is enlisted in Chicago on the 13th of June 1942 with the rank of private. Bill was assigned to the 4th Armoured Division at Pine Camp, New York. And after training in Tennessee and California, they moved to Camp Bowie, Texas, and finally Camp Miles Standish in Massachusetts for winter training. The division sailed from Boston on the 29th of December 1943 and landed in Wales in the United Kingdom and were stationed in camps in Wiltshire for 6 months, undertaking further training on Salisbury Plain. Assigned to Patton's Third Army, the 4th Division sailed from Southampton to Utah Beach in Normandy, arriving on the 11th of July 1944. They then took part in Operation Cobra and fought their way through France, defeating the SS Panzer Brigade in the Lorraine area and taking towns in northeastern France. Bill's 3 brothers, George, Raymond and Frank, were also fighting in Europe. Bill wrote to his brother Ray on the 30th of November 1944, saying, "Well, there's no need to talk about our daily life. We're in it together. And do you know, you're doing a man's job. I'm proud of you, including all the brothers. Yes, sir, we can't be beat. No, sir, not us as a team of the army. I'm in the best of health, physical and moral." He signs off with, "May God be with you always. Be careful and watch yourself. Beat the Boche to the draw. Best of luck, Bill." The 4th Division entered the Battle of the Bulge on the 2nd day. Spearheading the Third Army, they were the first to break through the German lines and relieve the trapped Americans in Bastogne. It was during the next phase, as the division left Luxembourg to cross the Rhine, that Bill received a fatal chest wound. He was killed in action on the 16th of March 1945. His hospital records show that he died from shell wounds to the chest. Bill was buried in the American Cemetery in Luxembourg. He was awarded the Bronze Star for heroic achievement and the Purple Heart for his fatal wounds. Bill's 3 brothers survived. It was an absolute honour for me to visit Bill's grave during a trip to Bastogne in December 2019, where I laid 3 crosses, one for this project, one personally from me and one from his family. I managed to contact his family, and it just so happened to be Thanksgiving Day that the urban family read my message explaining about the wall and what we were doing and the fact that I was researching him, and they sent photographs, and this is the message that came from them. Today is Thanksgiving Day, and we, the urban family, are saying thank you for this special gift. It's been an honour to be part of this project.
Ralph Leroy Groth served with the 88th Engineers Heavy Pontoon Battalion, which was assigned to the 1135th Engineer Group of the Third Army. Born in 1915 in Minnesota, he was the son of a German immigrant. Ralph was drafted in October 1940, then aged 23, and working as a driver and mechanic. He married Margaret in June 1941 and received his enlistment papers just over a year later, in August 1942. After training as a combat engineer with the 88th Brigade Support Battalion, he arrived in England on the 5th of April 1944. He was first stationed near Birmingham before moving to Southampton for embarkation. While here, he carved Ralph L. Groth, Davenport, Iowa, USA, into the brick of a house in Western Esplanade. The 88th arrived in Normandy on July the 22nd. Their job was to build pontoon bridges and enable troops to advance through Europe. They participated in the assault of the Siegfried Line, bridged the Mosel River 5 times, the Rhine and Main rivers, and then built a floating bridge across the Danube as the war ended. Back in the US in September 1945, Ralph returned to his job, where he clocked up 33 years of employment, later working at the City Bus Garage until he retired in the 1970s. Ralph passed away in October 2013, aged 98. In 1973, Ralph's brick was found by Mr. Webb. He managed to contact Ralph, who wrote, "I'd never even thought about leaving my name on that brick in England until I heard that Mr. Webb had photographed it. I was dumbfounded. It was so many years ago that it all happened. It is really unbelievable that someone would find my name there after all these years." Although we don't know the whereabouts of Ralph's brick, through this project we remember him and his service. Edward Julius Mayer, known as Eddie, also served as a combat engineer with the 88th Brigade Support Battalion, known as the Mule Skinners, and assigned to the Third Army. He was born in 1911 in Cook County, Chicago, Illinois. In 1930, Eddie was working as a machinist. His marriage took place around 1935, and by 1940, when he was drafted, he was working for the Milk Wagon Drivers Union. It is thought he enlisted in late 1941 when he began training with the 88th Brigade Support Battalion. Eddie's war story follows that of Ralph Groth, who he served with. After departing Boston in March 1944 and a brief stay near Birmingham, they moved through Southampton, which was when he carved Eddie Meyer, Illinois 7/21/44 into the outline of a landing craft on the brick of a house in Western Esplanade. We can only wonder if he was standing next to Ralph Groth at the time. They returned to the US in September 1945. We haven't been able to trace Eddie through online sources until his death in 1978 at Pell Lake, Wisconsin. William Biagio Racine served with the 2nd Truck Company of the Quartermaster's Corps. Born in Rionero, Potenza, Italy in 1920, he arrives in New York aboard the SS Contiverde in 1925. Settled in Yonkers, New York, by 1940 William is employed as a labourer in the construction industry. He was drafted in February 1942 and enlisted in the 2nd Truck Company in February 1945. He was then aged 24. William would have been in Southampton in 1945, during which time he carved WB Racine, PFC Co. M. New York H into a wall of a house. His brick is now part of the small wall. We have not found specific information about William's war service, but we know he returned to New York and married Grace in March 1946 when he was working as a salesman. Sadly, the next record of William is from a newspaper report of the couple's tragic death from a head-on collision, which happened when they were driving home from a Florida holiday in May 1955. William was just 34 years old. Jewett Augustus Calloway is thought to have served with an anti-aircraft command unit. He was born in 1916 in Jacksonville, Florida. By 1930, the family had moved to Miami-Dade, Florida. Jewett worked in a range of occupations, as a news dealer, shoe repairer, clerk, driver, and as a tobacco salesman. He married Evelyn in 1937 and by 1940 had 2 children. Jewett was drafted in 1943, aged 27, when at the time he is listed with a marital status as separated. It is unclear which unit Jewett served with, but the insignia of the Anti-Aircraft Command is visible in his uniform photograph. The 555th Anti-Aircraft Unit was assigned to the 104th Infantry Division that sailed from Southampton in September 1944. While waiting in Southampton, he carved Jewett A. Calloway, Miami, Florida, into the bricks. At the end of the war, Jewett returned to Florida. Both Jewett and Evelyn are listed together in the Florida City directories of 1949 and 1955. Records show they divorced in 1965 but remarried in 1972. Jewett remained in Miami until he passed away in 1992, aged 76.
Joe Mason was born in 1914 in Illinois. He was in the 449th Quartermaster Company, which was the oil and gasoline supply. His draft was dated 1940, and at that time he was married. He'd been married in 1936, and they had a son, Bobby Joe. In 1940, when he applied for the draft, he had his wife with him, Vincil, and she was pregnant again, and they both died in childbirth. Joe was enlisted on the 20th of October 1942 in the rank of private. We found his name and army number on a list of sailings on the LST 262, which sailed from Southampton to Rouen on the 25th of December 1944, and he's listed as a Lance Corporal then. So Joe went off to the war and was responsible for sort of moving the gasoline, petrol as it was, over to France to supply the troops moving forward east from the Cherbourg Peninsula. After the war, we don't really know what happened to him. I think he went back to Illinois. But Bobby Joe did very, very well, actually. He went on to be captain of the Harlem Globetrotters. And he was an all-round really good guy in the town. He did a lot of youth and community work. So I guess Joe Mason left that sort of legacy. Joe Mason died in 1968 at the age of 53.
Sergeant Robert David Breach served with the 799th Ordnance Battalion Light Maintenance, part of the 99th Infantry Division. He was born in 1915 in Catawissa, Pennsylvania. In 1940, at the time he was drafted, he was working as a labourer at the railroad. He was enlisted as a private in 1942, then aged 26. After 2 years training, Robert sailed from the US, arriving in England on the 29th of September 1944. While waiting to embark at Southampton, Robert carved R.D. Breach, Catawissa, Penna, into the wall of a house on Western Esplanade. 5 other men from the 799th carved their names too: Dransart, Draper, Helmling, Moore and Sabo. They sailed from Southampton between the 3rd and 7th of November. From France, they travelled to Belgium and the Ardennes. They faced their first combat defending a sector north of the Ruhr River. Here, the division, formerly known as the Checkerboarders, were given the new nickname the Battle Babies due to their young age and lack of battle experience. The 99th attacked the Siegfried Line and moved into the Ardennes. And on the 16th of December, the 99th found themselves on the northern shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge. Here they held out against the German forces until reinforcements arrived. Their actions were considered to be the most decisive of the Ardennes campaign. Robert arrived back in the US on Christmas Day 1945. After the war, he worked in a machine shop for 38 years and ran a coal distribution business on the side. He married Marion in 1947 and they raised 4 children. Robert passed away in Katowice in 2006, aged 91. Robert was one of the soldiers that Mr. Webb made contact with in the 1970s. A letter details that he was in Southampton about October 1944. He was waiting to be shipped out, and as he remembers it, and just casually carved his name on the building. He said, "After 29 years, it was such a surprise to find out that anyone would even notice a soldier's name on a building so very far from home. Robert Breach, 75 years later, we notice your name and remember." John Adam Helmling served with Robert Breach with the 799th Ordnance Light Maintenance Company of the 99th Infantry Division. He was born in Elyria, Ohio in 1920. His draft card shows he was working as a motor mechanic in 1941. By the time John is enlisted in November 1942, he had married Elizabeth. He arrived in England with the Ordnance Battalion. Their role was to maintain weapons and the vehicles that carried them. We know exactly when John was in Southampton, as his inscription reads, John Helmling, Elyria, Ohio, 11/4/44. He may have been standing with Robert Breach when they and 4 others from the 799th Company carved their names. John's war story is similar to Robert Breach, attacking the Siegfried Line prior to involvement in the Battle of the Bulge. Following the Ardennes campaign, the 99th went on the offensive from March 1945, clearing towns in the Rhine and pushing through Germany, including liberating 2 labour camps and a concentration camp shortly before WWII Day. John remained in Europe on occupational duties, not returning to America until February 1946. He returned to his job as a mechanic and to Elizabeth and his 2 daughters. Sadly, Elizabeth died in 1954. 6 years later, he married Helen, and they had a daughter, who has told us that her father often attended army reunions, and also told her how he had hated the boat journey to England as he was seasick most of the way. John passed away in 1993, aged 73, in Elyria, Ohio. Second Lieutenant David Harris Vance was a navigator aboard a B-17 bomber plane called the Scrappy Mike. He was part of the 326th Bomber Squadron based at an American air base at Poddington in Bedfordshire. David was born in American Falls, Idaho in 1917. He joined the Civilian Conservation Corps, which undertook conservation works on national parks. David met his future wife Jane while at Brigham Young High University. They married in February 1941. After graduating, David worked as an auditor at a Marine base in California. He enlisted in 1942 and trained as a B-17 navigator. He was called overseas in 1944 as part of the 92nd Bomb Group of the 326th Bomber Squadron. Although based in Bedfordshire, the crews travelled the UK on non-operational days, and we believe it was on one of these days that he visited Southampton and inscribed Dave H. Vance on the wall where so many other Americans had added their names. The last flight of the Scrappy Mike was in formation. The squadron took off for a milk run flight on the 13th of August 1944 over France, but an unexpected attack from the ground in Normandy hit only David's plane. The flak-hit plane held in mid-air for some time before falling. All but one of the crew, Maxwell Hartline, were missing, presumed killed. Maxwell was rescued by locals, hidden and cared for, and secreted back to the Allied forces. A memorial to the 8 men who died was built in the churchyard of St Clair de Helouse. The crash is still remembered and commemorated locally. David was buried in the American cemetery at Colville and was posthumously decorated with a Purple Heart, the Air Medal with oak leaf cluster. Jane was 7 months pregnant at the time of the crash. It is not known if she knew the fate of her husband at the time that their daughter Peggy was born. Jane went on to graduate and became a librarian for the Knapp Foundation. She never remarried, stating that she would always remain in love with her husband. Maurice James Wempen served with the 104th Infantry Division, who were known as the Timberwolves. Born in 1916 in Alton, Madison, Illinois, he was a high achiever at school. Maurice answered the young man's draft shortly after his schooling and was enlisted as a private in the Air Corps in June 1944, but transferred to the infantry. He was shipped to England in early February 1945. His time in Southampton was short, as he was soon in Belgium and then on to Germany. He was wounded in fighting at the beginning of March, but was able to write from his hospital bed. He had returned to the US by early July, where he recovered from the shrapnel wounds in his foot. Maurice then returned to education, graduating from Washington University St. Louis. He worked in cancer research for many years before moving into teaching. He was 65 when he married Marjorie in 1991. Maurice passed away in August 2008, aged 82. Maurice's brick inscription reads, M. J. Wempen, PFC. It was saved from a demolished building and now forms part of the small wall. Photographs of the brick in its original location show that the inscription was with other bricks that included Feb 25, 1945, giving the exact date that he was in Southampton. Woodrow Morris served with the 299th Engineers Combat Battalion. He was born in Burke County, Georgia in 1918. He was employed as a truck driver when he voluntarily enlisted in April 1941, arriving in England in March 1944. Woodrow was assigned as an automotive mechanic. They were deployed in advance of General Patton's Third Army to clear the way ahead of any obstacles and to build bridges. He returned to the US and was discharged in 1945. Woodrow was awarded the American Defence Service Medal, European Africa Middle Eastern Campaign Medal and the Good Conduct Medal. While waiting to travel to France, he had carved Woodrow Morris M. Augusta G.A. on one of the houses along Western Esplanade. This was one of the bricks saved from demolition and built into the small wall. Woodrow married Lucille in 1953 and they raised 6 children. He worked as a mechanic, a truck driver and a crane operator before retirement, and he passed away in 1989, aged 70. We heard from Woodrow's son Eric, who told us, "My dad was a storyteller and told of his times and adventures and the terrible things he had witnessed at war. He told of putting tanks back together, welding underwater at night with shells falling around he and his mates, of coming upon the concentration camps and the ghastly visions therein. He spoke of fonder things too, his time spent in England and of how much he favoured Italian wine when the fighting was finally over. War affected his eyesight and made him a sombre man, and left him with bad memories of the best and worst of our human condition. He spoke of war, but never as glory, recounting only the terribleness and the seriousness and the waste, reciting the respect he had for the defeated German soldiers and the austere affection for the good men he fought alongside."
All of these soldier stories and all of the research collected during the project has fed into our project viewer. The viewer is freely available on our project website at maritimearchaeologytrust.org/D-Day Walls. It features a 3D model of the wall itself. The model was created using photogrammetry, a technique which allows us to build up a 3D version of an object from lots of photographs. You can zoom in on the wall to see some of the names in more detail. In the top right corner, you can open the Details menu and then select name markers on the wall. In the window on the right, there are several tabs. It opens first on an introductory pane, but the next tab along shows the soldier's record, which contains details on their date of birth and death, any family details, and where they're from. The second tab contains the soldier's story, including their role in the war. Where we found them also included photographs of the soldiers, and these are in the Historic Photos section. The Graffiti tab explores the marks they left on the wall in more detail, with a close-up photo of their brick and sometimes a drawing overlay. Finally, the Documents tab contains other associations such as their draft cards. You can find out more about the project and see the answers to some frequently asked questions in the last two tabs in this pane. In the top left-hand corner of the viewer, there is another menu where you see a list of the soldiers. Clicking on the name will transport you to their brick and open their details. You can also search for a specific soldier here. If you'd like to visit the wall yourself, we've produced several self-guided activities to have a go at during your visit. The Memorial Walk, produced by volunteer Richard Wyatt, takes you on a tour of Southampton by way of several World War II memorials, finishing up at the D-Day wall. Once there, you can use our self-guided wall tour to explore the names on the wall in more detail. Don't forget to have a look at the small wall to the back of the main wall. For any geocaches out there, we've also hidden a history-themed one in the area, but you'll have to follow the clues on the geocache website to be able to find it. During the course of the project, we also created a banner exhibition which was displayed at the Central Library, the Leonardo Royal Southampton Grand Harbour Hotel next to the wall, and the National Oceanography Centre. Though the exhibitions are no longer live, you can see the banners on our website. We also undertook 6 talks to groups and 4 school and youth sessions during the project. Talks to groups included Southampton Archaeology Society, the Tudor House Museum, and the Lyndhurst U3A. The school sessions were also a big hit. During the sessions, students learned about World War II Southampton D-Day before getting to explore the wall themselves. We also challenged them to make their own landing craft out of scrap, and we had some fabulous results. One of several students who wrote to us after their session said, "We really loved the way you taught us about the D-Day wall and how to make a landing craft. I really enjoyed when I was making my team's unicorn boats. I also enjoyed looking at the names of the American soldiers." We've also produced a booklet aimed at parents and educators, which provides a background to the wall and some suggested activities if you'd like to do your own session there. The booklet is available on our website. The project saw our Discovery bus set up at several events for the general public to come and find out more about the wall and the project, including at the wall itself, at Leap Country Park, and at Royal Victoria Country Park. As well as schools and the general public, we were also really lucky to be visited in the summer of 2019 by a group of American veterans. They were absolutely delighted to see part of their history was being recorded for future generations. Alongside the 3D wall viewer, the exhibition banners and our other project outfits, you can also find much more reading material on the project website. There are several articles written by volunteers which delve deeper into subjects such as the 14th Port and hospital and troop ships, and of course our big project booklet, which gives an overview of the project, the history, and a number of the soldiers' stories. As we've heard, volunteers have been a huge part of all aspects of this project, from the research and the recording to helping with outreach events. Between April 2019 and December 2020, 75 volunteers have been involved, 57 of whom were new to the Trust. They contributed an amazing total of almost 400 volunteering days to the project. This was a phenomenal response to the call for volunteers for this project. Some of our project volunteers have very kindly shared with us their thoughts on their volunteering experience and what it means to them to have been involved.
Putting your finger in the initials of the name that someone who carved that all those years ago and where they were going, it is quite emotional, and you're terrified you're going to miss someone's name. That's what I was thinking about today.
I really wanted to do something for the D-Day celebrations and to preserve something for future generations.
This is a local part of history that may not be here in a few years' time, and it's my opportunity to give my time to help preserve that.
I have been helping to decipher the inscriptions on the wall, looking at the names and then trying to identify them from their names on the wall, and if they've put a date and maybe a state that they lived in, and then going through the draft cards. So volunteering by actually, trying to identify the soldiers and then looking at their past history before the draft date, where possible, what happened to them after the war.
As a volunteer, I had already worked with the Maritime Archaeology Trust on some other online research. And so it was quite easy for me to swap over to this online research, although this was even more interesting because it involved people.
I was asked initially at the very start of the D-Day Wall project to look into researching the 47th Royal Marines Commando. And then I transcribed a number of war-related videos from YouTube. And then I got into researching some names, and I didn't go very far with the individual names. It was more to establish a base point, and I did about 14 of those.
I learned an enormous amount from the volunteering because there were things that I had never known before. There was a form of email during the war for American servicemen that I had no idea.
Explore every avenue. So where you have a number of possibilities, trying to work out the most likely possibility, in as much as quite often their job before the war, because quite often that dictated what sort of unit they would be posted to, which would then be relevant to what that unit was doing in Southampton. So quite often it was looking at every possibility and learning to be patient to identify every possibility.
Never assume that a strange name is the only name in the world. There are so many people with the same name, and you have to double, sometimes triple check as far as you can that the person that you've identified you think is family related is in fact family related. And that was a big plus point, a learning point for me.
Oh my goodness, yes. I don't think I had ever appreciated the full scale of the operation. It just blew me away, and I think I almost sort of bored my family sick with telling them, oh my goodness, guess what I found out now.
I hadn't realised Southampton was so involved. You've seen the films and things, but Southampton's very rarely mentioned. Even in films of D-Day, Southampton's very rarely mentioned. So I didn't know they were so involved, didn't really know there were so many Americans. I mean, about 2 million, I found. I also discovered about the thing about racial inequalities during the war too, which I was not really aware of. We are so used nowadays to having mixed culture, mixed racial opportunities. And I was shocked to see the things that had happened to the African American soldiers who came over to England. As I said before, I found some newspaper articles on the millionth Yank, and became quite interested in him. So wanted to find out more about him, which I did at home. I learned a lot of skills. I learned how to look through obituaries, because he was American, obviously, and I wanted to try and trace his family. How to contact American newspapers, and so yeah, it became quite interesting, actually, quite a little project. Everyone who knows me now calls him my Yank because I get so enthusiastic and I spoke about him so much, you know.
I then was asked to, quite recently, in fact, one of my former schoolmates, he got to know through a friend of a friend that I was doing this kind of work. So he didn't know, his family didn't know much about his grandfather, who had been in the Royal Navy. And so he asked if I could investigate, which I did. And I was able to give him a fairly good chapter and verse of his service life from when he volunteered to just after the war.
I think I've enjoyed the most getting contact with the descendants of the military personnel. It only happened twice, but it was fascinating. But it made such a difference to them to know that there was something left of them, to think that some of their predecessors actually had left their mark in Southampton.
I've even, because I contacted the soldiers' the soldiers' family contacted me, because I couldn't find out any information. I'd contacted the original newspaper that I'd put the original article in 1944, and were still in existence, but are now an online newspaper. And I thought they would just be a tiny little letter, a little request for information, but they did a full article in the newspaper. And through that, his great niece contacted me to tell me about the family, and that. So it was interesting to find out all these years later, yeah, about someone I'd never met, but I felt as if I knew almost.
I can't wait to see this, the sort of final product. And I hope that, some of the families that we were able to get in touch with do look at it. And I hope they're touched by the memorial to their ancestors, which I still think it is a memorial to a lot of soldiers. Yeah. So I can't wait to see the finished product.
With a project like this, it needs to be credible and interesting, which it certainly is, but it also needs to be portrayed in a and publicized in a good fashion, and compliments to the trust for doing so.
It's especially under lockdown, it's been great having something sort of absolutely sort of really useful to do. Because when you're stuck at home, to feel you're making a difference to somebody is pretty good.
We're now going to examine the impact and legacy of the project. The key aims were to bring to life the stories behind the inscribed graffiti on the wall to help commemorate the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and also to raise awareness of the wall and Southampton port during World War II. As we have heard, providing opportunities for volunteering and involvement, as well as events and activities, were all part of how this was delivered. A number of people have been kind enough to share with us what they think of the project, and we will hear from them now.
The Maritime Archaeology Trust has carried out an amazing project to record these inscriptions and researched the names so their stories can be told. Throughout the website, the viewer can explore the wall, zoom into the bricks and see the inscriptions. I really enjoyed viewing the 3D model of the wall and reading about the soldiers whose names are on it. This model will now ensure the wall and these inscriptions are digitally preserved forever. I'm hugely impressed by the project team and the sheer perseverance of the volunteer researchers and the painstaking work of going through so many records to find details of an individual, often drawing a blank on surnames due to them not being totally clear. This did not stop the researchers. This is a perfect project for the MAT as they were able to use their expertise and technical skills of displaying 3D visuals of ships on the seabed. I note the project is great for education, offering a perfect local history study for every stage, and the Trust has also developed an excellent school education pack. I congratulate everyone involved in the project and recommend it to you all.
Hi, this is Sarah Bogle. I'm a councillor in Bargate Ward, and I'm also the council community heritage champion, and I'm really pleased to see the progress being made on recording the lives and the stories behind the graffiti of the American soldiers on what is now commonly known as the D-Day Wall or American Wall, which lies just near the De Vere Hotel in my ward, across the way from the old town. I think the Maritime Archaeology Trust have done a great job in seeking out so many of those stories behind that graffiti and bringing a really important part of Southampton's history to life a bit more. And I know that many people have been really fascinated by this particular example of our history, and I think if we can get a plaque and other ways of sort of marking the spot, I think it will continue to be a source of interest for the city as we move forward. Heritage is such an important thing for any place, and for Southampton it has so many stories to tell, and this is obviously just one of them. But we have always been had been very important in terms of how our port has played a part in our history, and I hope that we can make even more of it in our bid for City of Culture 2025 that we're hoping to put in this year into next. So thanks again, Maritime Archaeology Trust. It's a great initiative, and hope more people can find out about this great story.
I'm Mayor of Southampton, and we're delighted to host some American veterans who've come back to see a wall in which names were inscribed on their way to D-Day all those years ago. It's fantastic to see them. It's great to see them in Southampton. We owe them and the whole of the American people a huge debt for what they did for us during the war, and for that we will be forever grateful.
Here's 75 years ago, and we left the beach to go over to France from Trébort and trained in England and St. Ives. And it's very important to me because of the buddies that I lost. I have many of my friends that are not here anymore, and they're responsible for having me here, and they're also responsible for the kind of a great world we have, peace and prosperity since that time.
Hi there, my name's Andy Skinner. I'm part of the education team at Southampton City Council Cultural Services, and it's just been brilliant to be able to see the work that the Maritime Archaeology Trust has done on the American Wall, and certainly for my practice and my work in promoting and sharing Southampton's past, having the work that they've done, all of the amazing research to be able to share with our visitors, people on guided tours, all sorts of things. It's just been absolutely marvellous. Before the project, we did know about the wall. We did know that it was important, but it was in some ways hard to explore those stories in more detail, except to say that the American particularly the Americans came and this is what they left in the wall. But since the project and during the project too, getting those kind of all these new stories was just absolutely fantastic, and they're live stories that connect people, sort of 80 years on or so, but that really touches people in Southampton and across the pond as well, and it sort of connects us in a really special way. And the other thing that the project has really done is put the wall on the map. People now know about it. People talk about it a lot more. We go to it on our guided tours a lot more than we did in the past, and I'm sure that with this kind of great kind of bank of knowledge now and fantastic resources that are really accessible, that that work will have a really fantastic legacy going forward. And one final thing, I think what's really been fantastic has just been the way that different organisations have worked together in promoting the heritage based on the American Wall, and it's really encouraging for the city of Southampton and also wider understanding in history as well. It's just been great.
Hi everybody, I'm Dan Snow. I just want to add my voice to all those who've been praising the Maritime Archaeology Trust's D-Day Stories from the Walls project. It really sums up why I'm such a keen supporter of the Trust and why I believe that they're really the best in the world at what they do. They take archaeology, in this case, a bit of different archaeology, not the shipwrecks that they're often used to dealing with. It shows their versatility. These wonderful records of American servicemen who would go and land on D-Day. They do detailed analysis of that archaeology. They are able to then build out using traditional historical sources. They could build out a fuller picture of all the people leaving those markings, those writings on the wall. And finally, of course, they are so adept at presenting that in a way that's usable for schools and for the rest of us. The 3D project's amazing. The website is absolutely amazing. So from sort of getting the ideas in the first place, finding out wonderful sites to investigate, the execution and the delivery of that project is what makes the Maritime Archaeology Trust so brilliant, why we should all be supporting it and spreading the news. And I have been spending many, many hours on that website and enjoying it enormously, and I've been showing it to my kids as well. So thank you to the whole team for working so hard on it. It hasn't been an easy year, of course. I'm a huge admirer of you, and I look forward to seeing what you're going to come up with in the future.
We have been thrilled to receive such positive feedback on the project. It has been our privilege to record the wall and investigate the soldiers' stories. Delving into their histories has uncovered many untold stories of bravery and sacrifice that have added individual human experiences to D-Day and the war events beyond. We hope the project outputs form a fitting legacy for them and their service, not only to recognise the 75th anniversary of D-Day, but for all those anniversaries to come. In terms of legacies, we have created a permanent digital record of the wall and the inscriptions using the latest available recording and modelling techniques. This record can now be used to monitor the condition of the wall over time while solutions for preservation are considered. We have been able to tell the stories of 67 US soldiers from 29 different states. This has an enhanced understanding of the historical importance of the wall. It has also demonstrated how relatively recent history is of incredible personal significance to many with family connections to veterans. Making contact with the veterans' families and being able to share photographs of the inscriptions with them has been an honour. We thank all those who have kindly provided resources that we have shared today and are included within the project outputs. The online 3D interactive viewer means the graffiti, past research, photographs, historic documents and soldier stories are now accessible together to anyone and everyone with an internet connection. The viewer embodies how digital media is revolutionising how we can access, present and engage with heritage. The linked project resources, the booklet, education pack, walking tour, geocache, articles and this film all provide other ways for the wall and its stories to be enjoyed and will continue to be available via the project website. At the wall itself, we have installed a plaque to raise awareness of the wall to those walking past this piece of World War II history. In addition to these project-specific legacies, we have worked to help develop the skills and experience of volunteers involved. As we have heard, the project has inspired volunteers to undertake their own research, and we hope that they will continue to contribute to investigation of heritage in the future. Without the support of so many volunteers, it would not have been possible to achieve so much. The project has helped highlight how maritime heritage is so often embedded within much of the environment around us, particularly in a port city such as Southampton. With other examples of war-related graffiti being recognised across the country, this project may be the first of many to provide some new perspectives on Second World War history. The project has raised the profile of the D-Day wall locally, nationally and internationally. The research has enriched our understanding of the US soldiers' time in Southampton and has offered an insight into their experience. To the more than 3 million soldiers that passed through Southampton, we salute you. Thank you for watching. We hope you will be inspired to view the project resources and to find out a bit more about the work of the Maritime Archaeology Trust. Your interest and support is key to helping us continue our work, and we hope that you will dive in with us for future explorations. This project would not have been possible without the help and support of many individuals and organisations. We would also like to extend our thanks to the many volunteers who have been involved in all aspects of work. We have, of course, had funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and we would like to thank the fund and all the National Lottery players whose ticket purchases help make this possible. Within Southampton, we have had support from the Leonardo Royal Southampton Grand Harbour Hotel, whose car park is bounded by the wall. Southampton City Council have provided support through involvement of their staff in cultural services, libraries, archives and museums. Thank you to all the others who appear in the following credits for your support and contribution.